Welcome to the JCC Live Film Festival, coming to you from Buffalo, New York and Budapest, Hungary. One of the participants, the commentator, is my colleague and friend, Dr. Peter Forgash. Peter was born in Hungary just after the end of World War II. He left Hungary during the brief uprising in 1956. He spent some time in a displaced persons camp in Italy before moving to Canada and eventually to Buffalo. His undergraduate education was at Notre Dame. He went to medical school at Emory. He did a residency in ophthalmology at E.J. Meyer, which is now ECMC, which was affiliated with UB Medical School. A fellowship was done at Baylor in Houston, Texas, in retinal surgery. Then he served in the US Navy in Oakland, and where life as he knows it began. For there he met his wife, Kathy. He then returned to Buffalo to be with family and to open a retinal practice. Now he has 4 children and 4 grandchildren. He has 1 child that has remained in Buffalo, 1 that lives in Kansas City, and 2 that have moved back to Hungary. 2 grandchildren in Buffalo and 2 in Budapest. He's been very instrumental in an exchange program to educate Hungarians in the United States to further medical and financial development in Hungary. Several hundred have been educated in Buffalo, with almost all returning to Hungary to build the new Hungary. Peter, who once fled from Hungary, is now an honorary consulate of Hungary, and he is still a Hungarian citizen. Some of you may know his father, Tibor Baranski, who has had many honors here in Buffalo and also has been honored in Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. I'd also like to thank Peter for sponsoring this film and his very generous donation to the film festival.
Thank you, Steve.
And I'd also like to thank Katie Sontek. Without her, this discussion, this film festival would not have been possible. Again, thank you for tuning in and listening to Talkback Tuesday. Dr. Forgash, could you please give some brief comments about your initial impression of this film, sort of a mini synopsis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for that kind introduction. And Richard and I have been working together for 40 years, so I feel like we're Siamese twins, inseparable. We ski together, we work together, and we bicycle together. So he's a great friend, and thank you very much for this honor. I thought this was a very exciting film. It's a story that takes place right after the Holocaust and right before the onset of one of the bloodiest dictatorships in Hungarian history. It is about survival after an unfathomable trauma of 2 people. The film is based on a book called A Young Girl's Novel During Male-Dominated Period. And it was written by a lady called Zsuzsanna Várkonyi. She's a psychotherapist in Hungary. She was born 40 years after the Holocaust and had many relatives who died in concentration camps during that period. So she is in a very credible position to write about the Holocaust and adolescence and how they were affected by the trauma. The novel is about 2 traumatized persons finding each other. One is a 40-ish OBGYN doctor, Clara and Aldo, who's a quiet, emotionally broken physician, and a 16-year-old girl, Clara, who is covering her pain through her loudness and boisterousness, and sometimes an in-your-face attitude. Both are Holocaust survivors, and both lost their families. Aldo lost his wife and 2 sons, and Clara lost her parents and younger sister. There's some denial for Clara and hope that her parents are still alive in the POW camp somewhere, and she keeps writing letters to them, which is, of course, never mailed, but puts into a box. Clara and Aldo, or all of that, meet when Clara's aunt, Olgi, takes her for a medical examination because she thinks that Clara is not developing sexually. Here we see two people, this young girl who is a apparently very bright girl, somewhat arrogant adolescent, and the Hungarian word shuni is basically what it means. It's a very appropriate one that the doctors call her. It's a prickly porcupine. And you can see in her attitude that, yeah, she could be quite prickly at times. And on the other hand, we have this doctor who is working on his laws, possibly with silent terriers. And I think there are some motivations in some scenes in the film that indicate that. On the other places, he unaccurately says that he lost all his faith in religion and God. Their relationship results in a multi-level, extremely complicated relationship that the outside world sometimes misunderstands and certainly has difficulty comprehending. For Clara, she's looking at the physician as a substitute father. Their relationship deepens, while at the same time, in the 1948 Hungary is descending into communist terror. As the story progresses, the relationship between Clara and Aladar moves into a sex-free, but certainly eyebrow-raising relationship. Throughout the film, there's a tension that the relationship could change and become physical. The occasional looks and touches between the two protagonists could potentially move into a sexual relationship, but it never did. It is a friendship or relationship which becomes life-saving, a slowly healing one, which in the end allows them to release each other and start new families separately on their own. There are also many comical, or not many, but some comical episodes, such as taking a bath, shaving, discussing math and linguistics, but this is always counterbalanced by the recurring hurt and guilt feelings of the survivors. Clara has repressed these feelings very deeply, but occasionally, with a few uttered words, it comes to the surface. Aladar, on the other hand, has great inner struggles with his guilt, but internalizes his hurt. He cannot talk about it. He has a set of photo albums, which he has hidden and has not touched since he came back from the camps, but allows Clara to look at them while he's gone, but asks them to put it back before he returns. The movie also gives historical glimpses of the bloodiest Stalinist terror. Having a suitcase packed ready to go under the bed, having a car stuck under your window in the middle of the night, followed by loud steps in the staircase, screams and rumble next door, or a friend confessing to Aladar that he signed a paper to spy for the secret police. But essentially, the book is one of optimism and hope. Severely traumatized people are able to stand up and regain yearning for happiness and life. And let me quote the writer of the book who said, "I wanted to write something very human, something I received from my surviving relatives. The ugly and the inhuman has been written many times." This is from the writer. The exploration by film of Hungary's 20th century has always been a very, very sensitive topic. And not just the Holocaust, a lot of other topics. Part of it was the 50 years that communists were in control, and for whatever reasons they had their own reasons to push these under the rug. And it wasn't until the past 30 years that things started to open up, and some valuable and high quality films were made on this topic in Hungary. A prime example of this film is the Oscar film that was, I think, shown in Buffalo a few years ago, Son of Shaul. Today's film is not directly about the Holocaust or the war. The tragedy of the victims doesn't end with their survival. For these people, after returning from the death camps, a new set of challenges is open. Something that probably every Hungarian could identify with one way or the other, because every Hungarian has burned into their DNA, or every Hungarian family at least has burned into their DNA the horrors of the war and the post-war. And the film reflects this period very, very well. This is a film done on the but with lots of imagination. The producers were able to create the period very authentic. And I think it's an excellent film, and it was a runner-up for an Oscar.
Thank you very much, Peter. At the beginning, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Richard Leppy. This is my wife, Arlene Leppy. We're both on the film committee for the Buffalo Jewish film. At this point, we are going to ask Dr. Forgash some questions. We would also like questions from the audience. You can post your questions on the chat, and we will look at them and at the appropriate time ask Dr. Forgash. I would like my wife, Arlene, to begin with some of the questions and comments about the film.
Yes, thank you. Very good presentation, Dr. Forgash. I really enjoyed hearing all of those details. And while you were speaking, though, I was thinking about how accurate, either literal or in meaning, was the translation of the Hungarian into English. And one example I noticed was that the Clarica, is that how you say it? Clarica becomes little Clara in English. And you did clarify what sunny is. And how do you pronounce the sunny in Hungarian?
Shuni.
Shini?
Shuni.
Shuni, forget Hungarian.
So,
yeah, so how does it, and then how does the Hungarian change from formal to personal and its impact on the story? So maybe first just looking about the translation.
well, the translation was done quite well, but there's no question that you lose a lot in the translation. And also words that you say to a Hungarian, like secret police, okay? It sounds horrible to you, but to me, I noticed that when they were, and in Hungarian, it's called ABO, a State Security Bureau. The first time I saw this film, I could feel tenseness coming in me, just from that word. I could feel my palms getting sweaty. Maybe I had tachycardia a little bit. And it was something that you cannot translate. You have to live it. And then when somebody says that word, then you have a physiological response to it. And these are things there's no way a translator could pass on.
Yeah, there was one comment I was going to make. I have 3 grandchildren, all in the same age group as Clara. So I like that word sunny. I might just call them little sunnies because I can't pronounce the Hungarian. So we're going to have to work on that, because even though they don't have the baggage of Clara, they have the personalities and some of her attitudes. Richard wants to make a comment.
When you take Clarica means an affectionate term, if I'm not correct, used in Hungarian. They also have that in Polish and other languages. But when it's translated into English, it means little, just means in size, or little in quality or something. So it loses that flavor, at least to me. That's why we asked it. And also the word sunny means sunshine, bright, bubbly, which is just the opposite of what she was. And so I looked at it in a totally as if it were negative connotation rather than something at all positive or at all describing her nature. So that's why we asked those questions, what it is. And I guess the other part of Arlene's question is, how do we follow the change in the relationship between the formal Hungarian and the personal Hungarian, which is totally different than in English.
It starts off with a formal Hungarian, and maybe about a fourth down, 25% down into the film, it changes abruptly into the more familiar form. Which she kind of, because usually the way it's done is that the older people will say, well, why don't you just use the informal terms with me? Now, Shuni doesn't wait for that. She just takes it upon herself and start calling him on the most familiar basis. Yeah.
Yes, and even when she remarks about how bad his clothes are right in the beginning, when he walks her home, where'd you get that coat? But he doesn't, he's very clever. He doesn't always answer her. So another object that really stood out for me in the film were the telephones. Both the families had telephones, and there seemed to be a little situation that would occur where something would come up that would be sensitive. You would see someone pull the cord or stick the telephone in a drawer. Was this a common thing? Were telephone conversations frequently monitored?
Always. And I've seen this innumerable times. I remember I have images of this from childhood on. And also lowering your voices, pulling down the shades, closing the windows, and whispering.
Really? Yeah. So they were able to monitor just everybody's telephones?
Well, I don't know if they recorded everybody's, but let me tell you how the telephone worked in my hometown, okay? This was in the early 50s. It was all party lines. And number two, I don't think there were too many telephones in the city of 30,000 people. And the way I had to make a phone call was that I'd call the operator, and then I'd tell him, and I just remembered now, thinking back, I never told them the number. I just said, I'd like to talk to the Sobel family or the Smith family. And she knew who they were. Obviously, she could listen to all the phone conversations that she wanted to. And I wouldn't be surprised if at least some of them weren't told to monitor phone calls. I don't think certainly, I don't think we were important enough to have them spend the monies to record on tape our conversation. But I'm sure that they listened in, and if there was anything suspicious, they'd let the Security Bureau know.
Did your parents caution you about what you should say on the phone or who you should speak to?
Oh, absolutely. Not only on the phone, but who you should speak to. And I know that my mother, like if we were sitting at a table and I was getting into a dangerous area, my mother would really pinch my thigh. And that meant shut up.
You knew that was coming. Well,
yeah. But the thing is that sooner or later, you kind of self-censor. It was amazing thinking back at 8, 7, and 8 years old. You self-censored yourself. On the one hand, and in the class, we had about 35 kids in the class. Oh, I had about 3 or 4 guys that I suppose they were closer to me and we could trust. And just the conversations we had, think of this, an 8-year-old kid, it was Eisenhower and Adenauer who were the big guys at that time. And we were listening to Radio Free Europe. And we'd go to school and we'd say that, oh, Eisenhower said this to the Germans, the other. We had probably no idea what significance it had, but we had it down, and we had it down that they're the good guys, and these guys in Hungary are the bad guys. And we also knew to keep our mouth shut and not talk about it to certain kids in the class. And my grandmother was a great fan of Radio Free Europe, and the way it would work was that she had this Blaupunkt, a German radio, I don't know, left over from war or something like that. And she'd be listening to the crackling voice, and you'd always have to readjust to get the thing. And then I was told to stand by the door, and if somebody was coming, I was supposed to let her know to turn off the radio. And that's how we got our news.
Peter, that reminds me of the incident in the early 70s when I met you in Budapest, that we were in the flat of your friends and relatives. You always told me to keep my mouth shut and not to say anything because someone was listening. And they probably were, because when I went back to the hotel, when I got up to my room, I had a knock on the door. And I said, "Who was it?" And the guy says, in the middle of the night, "We want to check your minibar to see if you used anything."
Wow.
And I opened the door and slammed it in his face. And he was so in shock because I spoke out against him that he disappeared and they never bothered me again.
Yeah.
You're lucky. Yeah, well, okay. Well, the other thing that really fascinated me too, with besides the telephones in their apartments, is the contrast between Aldo's apartment and Olga's. His was very austere, very minimal. It was like didn't have, excuse me, a pot to pee in, and that little 2-burner stove he had, and he just seemed to have so few items in his torn sweater. Whereas Olga seemed to have much nicer apartment, bigger, better furnished, nicer china. And we wondered, would you have any information about how did they obtain their apartments and who allocated who would get what?
Okay, 2 questions. The reason that Aldo had this rundown little apartment was that he was a very despondent guy. He didn't really care about what it looks like or any comforts. He was too preoccupied with other his experiences. Now, Olga, I don't think she, from the movie, that she didn't quite comprehend what on earth happened during the war and Holocaust. I mean, she wasn't quite, she knew it, but she didn't know it. And she herself says she's not very bright and this and that. Now, most likely that was her apartment. It's an upper or middle class apartment looking apartment that looked like before the war. And she probably, she was probably a very non-consequential person in the eyes of the party, and they just let her be there. And she was used to keeping an order there and keeping it in a certain manner, worrying about what kind of china you have. There's that other scene, there's some other relative that comes looking for her china that was told to live outside of Budapest. To these people, these outside symbols, okay, meant a lot. But to Aldo, I'm sure that as a physician, he could have had a better, even under communism, a better apartment, but he was too despondent, and his mind was he was living in a different world.
So their clothes and their furniture and other objects portray a kind of an accurate picture of people.
Very accurate. I've seen so many of those apartments, those kind of apartments. Even now, with older people, you go in there and that's how it's furnished, and you can kind of guess the type of furniture they'll have. So yeah, very well.
Yeah, and even where they found those telephones, they're even different than the type of phone. I had one of those phones too, but they looked so different than the Hungarian ones.
Yeah.
Almost like a collector's item today.
Well, it is. Well, remember, this was 70 years ago.
Right. So there also seemed to be a shortage of food items, such as sugar, eggs, and butter. And how great were these shortages, and did they affect you or your family as well?
Okay, right after the war for a couple of years, and these are years I hear, this is that I know from my parents, okay, I don't remember it personally. Yeah, there was a shortage of sugar, and you can tell that in the film also. And they used to give out little tickets, and you could buy only so much sugar per week with those tickets. Later on, this liberalized, and you had no problem getting sugar, salt, and herbs. What you had problem getting, and I didn't have any of these Mediterranean fruits such as oranges, tangerines, figs, bananas. I've never seen them until I got into Italy. They were available to the party members. There were stores there in Hungary that were for high party members, and basically they could buy any of these so-called luxury items. But I didn't. I had my first tangerine and orange when we got to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So these things, all the way up to 1956, when we left Hungary, they were not an item that were sold.
I remember also as a young girl in the late 40s, I had relatives in England, and England also suffered greatly from the war. And I remember my mother sending care packages to them because they had so many food shortages. And so things were difficult for them as well.
Yeah.
Talking about food, Peter was such an interesting character. To me, he was the breath of fresh air in this whole film because he was happy, optimistic, had a wonderful sense of humor. And I think he just brought this brightness to the film where everything else was still grim, dismal, and people were so depressed. And they were trying to deal with living not only after the war, but then with the communist regime. So when he offers her a chocolate bar, Clara is really amazed that he could obtain such an item. So Peter, it sounds like he was a trader of everything, which implies that there were shortages of many goods, but he must have been very resourceful and also a little cheeky because I think you kind of had the black market sort of thing going on, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know what your response would be to that.
Okay, you're absolutely right. They used to call these in Hungary cheftelő. That was the word for it. And the way it worked was the following. Now, soccer in Europe is a very, very important sport, and certainly was the big sport in Hungary during the 50s. And Hungary was basically the premier soccer nation in the whole world. Now, these soccer players, they couldn't pay them the salaries that Western players get. You know, look at Messi and Ronaldo and these guys.
Yeah.
But what they were able to do was that they went to the West and they got items, and they were like the border guards or the party kind of closed eyes on these guys coming in. And the big things were, this was in the 50s, women's nylon stockings. And they brought them in by the suitcase full. Then girly pictures.
Of course. Yeah, well, I know he mentioned that he brought, go ahead.
Chocolates, you know, like this guy. And
Yeah.
these guys, like Peter, was one of the distributors, okay? And it just, when I was watching the film, or bringing in wristwatches. And I remember that Hungary, it was playing in soccer, the Swiss national team. And the joke was that the Swiss makers against the watchmakers against the watch smugglers. And they become, and and the government kind of closed eyes to them, shut their eyes on this, and then they sold it. And Peter was one of these guys that was probably a distributor for some soccer player or some other athlete, not just soccer players, but soccer players were the biggest ones. And that's how he got the chocolate. But you're right, you couldn't buy those kind of chocolates in Hungary. And Maria Hilferstrasse was the big shopping center in Vienna. And that was, I remember hearing that since age 4. We bought it at Maria Hilferstrasse. You know, every Hungarian that went to Vienna went to the Maria Hilferstrasse.
What would have happened to Peter if he were caught?
Well, it depends what kind of connections he had.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
and get away with it.
You know, when you're in that black market, that type of idea, I mean, these weren't state secrets or anything like that. He probably pay off the number one. The government knew these guys, and so you know the system had to go somehow. occasionally, if somebody was really, really getting a real pig about it, then they crack down on it. Maybe he could get out by giving a couple of bars of chocolate to the police, or if they wanted to make an example of him, that he might get a year or two in jail.
That brings me to a remark of remembering when I traveled in the mid 60s, early 60s in Eastern Europe. I traded money on the black market, and I often asked the people who I was trading with, what did they fear of getting caught, what they did the money, and almost invariably everyone would say they were working for the government and they didn't care, and it was all government sponsored. And also, as the dollar was king, when I first started traveling, I tried to buy tickets, train tickets, bus tickets, and it was very difficult because you had to go into a central place, you had to show your documentation, you had to change money officially. And afterwards, instead of spending 5 to 6 hours to buy the train ticket, I put $1 US bill in my passport. And they would take the US dollar and say, thank you. And that was the end of it. So eventually I never bought any tickets while traveling in Eastern Europe. So I think that's a similar thing, even though it wasn't in the 50s, it extended into the 60s and probably into the 70s before the collapse of communism.
Actually, it went into the 80s because I took my son Nando in the mid 80s to Hungary, and there was it's called Vidam Park. It's an amusement park, a very miniature Disneyland. And basically, there was this ride that he liked, and we kept buying tickets. And finally, the lady said, "Well, if you give me, I forgot, maybe 50 cents or something like that in American currency, then he can ride the whole day."
Yeah.
So that's how the system worked. Totally corrupt.
I'm going to let you do the rest of the questions because this is similar.
Okay. So at the beginning of the film, Aldo becomes the surrogate father for Clara. We assume that she attaches to him because of similarities with her real father. Clara's father was an MD. Aldo smelled like Clara's father. He shaved like Clara's father. Aldo liked reading in German. Clara was very interested, from what I can gather, in foreign languages and translating things in its original, which showed that she was very perceptive and precocious for her age, even though she called school a bunch of shit. She actually called most of the translations stupid. How did people in Hungary look at people that were learning reading in German and later in Russian during the occupation? Was it looked on favorably or askance?
Okay, number one, German language was looked upon as the high culture. There's no question about it. And that was before the war, going back to the time of Bismarck. And, they had the best universities, if you want, they had the Harvards of the time. And the writers, she's talking about Thomas Mann. Okay, It's just amazing that a 16-year-old girl would be reading Thomas Mann. Okay, and so German culture was very, very overbearing and very high. There's no question about it. And this tradition carried on after the war, and people were reading German literature, the German authors, and I was learning also German after school with 4 other kids. But we had to do it secretly because you didn't get punished, but certainly it wouldn't be a positive point for your parents to be told that your son is learning German. So, and to this day, I think Germany, and it's going to be for geographical reasons, a very important language in Central Europe, not just in Hungary, but the other Central European countries. Russian, they got a bad rap. Okay, Russian literature, if you read that, it's fantastic, it's phenomenal. And I love Russian authors. But when you have an occupying power forcing it down your throat, it becomes a joke, and everybody got straight A's because everybody would have flunked. So it became a game there, and nobody cared about learning Russian, which is a shame because, like, I think Russian literature is just it's a whole new world.
I agree with you. I just want to make one point that my daughter-in-law, who's from Poland, had the same situation where they were forced to learn Russian, and she can understand Russian and speak Russian. But again, people were so opposed to that control over their life that Russian represented a dictatorship to them. So I think it was difficult for people to rationalize that it was a language worth knowing.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I agree with you 100%, Peter. When I traveled in Eastern Europe, I spoke pretty much only German for a whole summer. Most people did not speak English. Yeah. And I asked why they didn't speak Russian. And it was the same thing that you are saying, is because of the oppression. And I said, but then the Germans oppressed you too. But they said, that was different. That was before. The Russians are here now, and we want as little as possible to do with the Russians. So I think that just permeated the whole society in Eastern Europe. To go to a different, about the relationship between Clara and Aldo. Aldo was single, male. He's somewhat warm. He lacks a family. He lacks a woman in his life. Clara is very cold the first time they meet in his office, but then, based upon the other question, warms up and wants him as a surrogate. Was it common at all for single males to foster young girls? Would Clara actually be looked upon as a whore, as Olga intimates? And what were the actual mores of post-war Europe in Hungary?
Well, the actual mores, they were pretty puritanical. And I have to say, the Russian Communist Party was very, very puritanical. And if you were caught having extramarital affairs, chances were good they kicked you out of the party. Okay, that's one. Number two, the relationship between Clara and Aldo. Okay, put yourself, you're a physician. Even today, 2020, excuse me, a 16-year-old girl comes into your office, okay, out of the blue, they hardly know, and develop I think people would look at it askance today too, if there's a quick relationship like that developing, okay? If you were an uncle that you grew up with and she's fond of you and what have you, old friendships, that would be a different story. But this was moving way too quickly. And yes, I can understand raising eyebrows. And I think it would raise today also.
It seems that both Aldo and Clara have no faith in God, in religion. They were rejected by the Supreme Being. And actually, it's funny, in the film, there are very few references to Jews, Judaism, or any other faith, as a matter of fact. There are a few clues that many people might have missed because they were so infrequent when looking at the film. There was the tattoo on Aldo's arm. There was the Star of David on the orphanage. There was a mezuzah on the door of the pediatrician. And we faintly, very faintly, because I had to turn up the volume, that when Clara became ill and Olga opened the door to bring him, it looked as if he was praying, which we assumed, but if you really listened, he was saying a prayer in Hebrew for healing. How prevalent is lost faith then, and how prevalent is lost faith now in Hungary? And what, if any, was the role of religion at the time of the film?
Oh God, you're asking a sociological question. I don't know any statistics on that, but I think from reading, that either you became very religious or you were totally turned off to religion. Or, in this movie, he does say unequivocally that I lost all my faith, I lost all my religion. That's one thing. But like you said, it also struck me that he went into that dark room, and for about 3 seconds, there was this little clip and I took it as a prayer also. Then there was this other talk about when they're in the park and she has her head on in his lap, talking about heaven and going to heaven and being together. So I took it as people with all this trauma, at the same time being very intelligent, and the concept of God is really one of the most exciting things to discuss. That people call it the struggling with the concept of God and the concept of suffering. I think it shows a lot of maturity on certainly on Clara's part, that she was even interested in this topic we're talking about.
How?
And excuse me. And when he was examining her in his office, he asked her to lift her left arm up, and I wonder if he wasn't looking if she had a tattoo on there.
Oh, no, I thought he was looking to see if she had any pubic hair to show that she would.
Well, that's
puberty.
okay.
Underarm here.
Yeah.
To change the
Not pubic
subject,
hair, underarm.
there are many questions about that in the relationship and the sexual relationship between the two. But let's go on because time is getting short and we do want some questions from the other people. Peter seems to be overjoyed. He runs into the apartment, turns on the radio, and Starlin has just died. He is so optimistic about changes in his ability to not trade under the table, to go to Vienna, to go to America, to go anywhere. How realistic was that? And what were the consequences? And how did Hungary change, if at all, after the death of Stalin?
It's totally realistic, totally real. Right after Stalin died, there was a communist concentration camp very close to my hometown. And again, it was one of those things that you didn't dare to mention the name of it, okay, but everybody knew it was there. That was disbanded. Then the secret police was disbanded. They reformed it under other names. Rákosi, who was the dictator in Hungary, was dismissed, and Imre Nagy became premier. My father, Tibor, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, and he had amnesty in 1953 when Stalin died after 5 years of prison. So yes, there was definitely a big thaw. And people were let out of prison. A lot of people were let out of prison. So it did have an effect, yes.
So at this point, I would like to have Arlene say some comments about the director, because I do want to allow time for general questions. I have probably another 50 questions, but we're going to dispense with that. Maybe at some other time.
Maybe next week. So I listened to a couple of interviews with Barnabas Toth. He was the director of the film. And as Peter mentioned, it was based on a book written in 2004. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you mentioned, but the author had lost quite a few family members during the Holocaust. So this was a very important subject for her. Initially, they had difficulty working together. When Barnabas wrote the first draft, she didn't like it. So he had to leave out a number of characters and change things. And eventually they agreed on the cast, and she was very pleased with the final result. And as we've mentioned, the sexual tension was very evident. Apparently in the book, it's a lot more available or a lot more portrayed than it is in the movie. But Barnabas didn't want it to be anything sexual. He said he wouldn't even allow a kiss to transpire, but they could do some hugging. So it makes the doctor seem more of a hero and a morally respectful man. And also, as we mentioned, he became her surrogate father. And even though Barnabas wasn't Jewish, he said he identified so much with it because he had grown up culturally with Jewish people and knew a lot about their background. It was a very low budget film. They had very little time to do it. So he said they had to have a lot of rehearsals. And they focused on the faces, as you could see, and the feelings and the interiors. And one of the things that really sticks out for me is when you mentioned that he had a dentist appointment, but he left the photo albums for Kyla to look at because he couldn't deal with it. And the whole time she was looking at was total silence. And I think that made it really moving. And then, of course, her reaction to seeing the pictures and the memories that it brought back for her. And he did try to focus on the human positive side. And one of the other problems he had was finding a girl that could show multiple ages. He auditioned a lot of young girls, and it took a while before they found one that they found would fit Clara's background and her looks and whatever. And he said his cameraman was terrific. He was very good. He said he never had to tell him when to take a shot. He would know where to go, and it was mostly interiors and empty streets. And he said it was a bluish kind of light that they used, and he used a wide lens to take his shots. And then he left the ending open-ended with Clara on the bus, and that's kind of shows a positive feeling. We're not sure about Aldo, but we assume he's also moving on into a more positive life. And he thought the composer was excellent, that it was a very delicate score that he developed, and he was very happy with it. That's it.
Okay, we have some other questions.
But don't you want to?
We have some other questions that seem to have appeared on the chat.
Oh,
The one is, when Clara gets ill, the pediatrician made a house call. Was this common to make house calls at that time in Europe? And could you comment on the quality of medical education and medical services, and what, if any, charge there were at that particular time?
Yes. Okay. House calls are very, very common. You didn't go to the emergency room, you called the doctor and they'd make a house call. And Hungarian medicine has been up to par. A lot of the doctors studied in the West. It was Berlin that they went to, or Vienna. And as far as charges, it was a government run institution, but you had to pay also the doctor. It's really an embarrassing thing, but a tip. You had to put an envelope and money, because what the government paid them was next to nothing. So you subsidized it with an envelope.
Another one from a member of the committee. You saw the film Fever at Dawn, where a patient with TB in Sweden was searching for the relatives by posting notices in Hungarian papers. Based upon this, that film and this film, was it realistic for Clara to feel that maybe her parents had survived and were somehow either in Switzerland or Holland, as she said? And was there any government organization that tried to unite people who survived the Holocaust with relatives in other countries?
I don't know if there was a government organization, but I think it was usually the International Red Cross that was doing this. And I think there were some Zionist organizations also that got involved in it at the end of the war. This was, I was alive at the time, but I really don't remember. I was awake, 46, 47, 48. I was about 2 years old. And by the time my memory work goes back, all these things were pretty much passé.
One of the people asked, could Olgi have been a non-Jew that had Jewish relatives?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
This is a question about what you're feeling. Olgi, the comment is, could Olgi be a non-Jew that had Jewish relatives?
You mean Aladar, the physician?
No.
No, the aunt.
The aunt.
If she could, She was Jewish.
Yeah,
That's what I thought too.
that's what we thought too, but there was a question, and maybe your perception was different of
No,
how
because
many-
it was the aunt to. Well, I see what you're saying, that she married into a Jewish family as a
Correct.
non-Jew.
I don't think so.
I don't know. It never occurred to me.
It
I
could be.
suppose it's possible. You know, that was, I have to tell you,
Oh, she said-
in Hungary, it's really, you know, there's such a mixture and intermarriages between Jews and non-Jews that if you go into genealogy, sooner or later you're going to find that one of your great grandfathers was Jewish, or great grandmother. So it's certainly not uncommon. No.
I think the person was asking the question because of what we talked about before, that Aldo had basically nothing, but Olga seemed to have retained everything that she had before the war, which we think would be unusual for a Jew that either hadn't married a non-Jew or passed as a non-Jew during the war.
Well, a lot of times during the war, I heard that if Jews were, or those Jewish people that were taken to a concentration camp, they left their belongings with some Gentiles, and they were hiding them. And I think that was part of it when that lady was coming to Aldo to look for her things, and it was down in the basement. They didn't elaborate on it, but the only thing I could think of it is that during the war, she took it there. Somebody put it down into the basement. Aldo had absolutely no interest, just like he had no interest in looking at the albums. He wasn't going to mess with these household items. Certainly, you mentioned that he lived a very austere life. That was probably the last thing of importance to him.
One of the questions was, the person said, I'm confused by the last scene after Stalin's death. Aldo was shocked and afraid that the relative happiness might be shattered. So it seemed like there were mixed emotions when they heard that at the party.
Well, I think he mentions that, is this a provocation? Okay. You know, this goes to show you the semi-paranoid mind of living under communism, that you always think that, is this real, or are they just spreading this rumor? So they want to know who are the people that start celebrating and being jubilant about it, and take care of them later. I think that's what went through his mind, through Aldo's mind, when he was saying that, could this be a provocation?
On one last note, his question, could you comment on, do you have or could have any relationship with the Hungarian Jewish community, both past, present, and future?
Who, me?
You
Yeah.
personally, how is your relationship with the Jewish community?
I know.
What do you feel that's going on with Judaism in Hungary, how it's progressing? Are there more Jews? Is it open to be Jewish in Hungary?
Yeah, number one, it's a very, with a bad history, the incredibly bad history. I'm very happy to say that Jewish life is really, really progressing in Hungary, advancing. They have a Jewish festival there, not this year because of the coronavirus, for a whole week. Jews consider Hungary to be the safest, one of the safest places in Europe, certainly a lot safer than Britain or France or Germany. And Hungary has excellent relations with Israel, government to government. And they are very strict about total zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. And while even in the United States, you had that murder in Pittsburgh, and I think San Diego was another place, and then last fall in New Jersey. Nothing like that, not even close, has ever happened in Hungary. And I think it's a thriving Jewish community. There's basically two big groups there. One of the, what they call them neologues. These are the more liberal Jewish people. and the other ones are the Lubavitch, Hasid Lubavitch. And I met some of those Lubavitch people there, and we had some nice chats. I also had a couple of years ago, we had two Jewish kids, one of my two students here. They met here and they got married at Shir Shalom. So I was one of the ones holding up the huppah.
And also when we were in Budapest, we went to that wonderful synagogue with the fabulous cantor.
Yes.
It's the Doheny?
Okay, there's a Doheny synagogue, and it's probably the most beautiful synagogue in Europe. And I don't know if it's the largest one, but certainly one of the largest ones. Number two, there's an Orthodox synagogue just opened, and I sent the pictures to you and Richard on the Rumbach Street, and it is just out of this world how beautifully they recreated it. And I just found out that the synagogue in my town in Gyöngyös is the second largest one in Hungary, in the countryside, outside of Budapest.
Interesting.
That seems to be the end of some of the questions. I'd like to thank you, Peter, for your insight into life in Hungary today and at the time of the film, and your understanding and conveying in the film. I'm sort of a little sorry that the film is past, that people can't go back and look at the film now with a different light. Perhaps we might be able to open it up later. If we do, we will notify all of the people in the audience. It really makes a difference when you talk about a film and see the film again and again and again. There are a lot of subtleties in this film that really could be missed the first time. And with a good background, you will see these differences.
I also want to thank you. I just want to say thank you, because knowing the Hungarian makes such a difference in the translation and understanding of the film and the way that their life was, rather than just, I love foreign films, but if you don't know the language, you do miss a lot of it. So we thank you for your special comments about it.
Anytime, and I totally agree with you, with Richard, that I watched it 3 times also, and every time I watched, a new subtlety came up. Yeah, and I encourage you to watch it. I think it's a great movie. I have to find out now how popular it is in Hungary, and I think it should be in more intellectual circles. And again, thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope the people will take the effort and go to Budapest. Hopefully next year this Jewish festival will take place again, and it's a great city and a very vibrant Jewish life. I think that's the only place where they have in Central Europe rabbinical seminary, and it's a big one. Very astute rabbis teaching there, so I got nothing but good things to say and beautiful things to say about the Jewish life in Budapest. Thank God, and I hope it's going to continue like that.
Great.
Thank you again for talking, and
My
thank
pleasure.
you for being so generous in sponsoring this film so that we could all enjoy it.
And we'll go back to Katie.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'll continue on with the thank you. So it was wonderful that I was able to kind of sit back and enjoy this great conversation. So I just again want to thank Arlene and Richard Leppy for facilitating tonight's discussion. As they mentioned, they're both longtime members of our volunteer film festival committee and huge supporters of the JCC and all our cultural arts programs. So thank you again. And to our guest speaker, Dr. Peter Forgash, this was really wonderful. I think not only for you to speak and answer questions on the film, but to be able, as Richard just mentioned, to be able to kind of add your personal stories and these insights. It just really, it made it more engaging, the whole conversation tonight, and we learned so much more about the film. So thank you again, and for your sponsorship. I know when we're looking to find sponsors for our film, I do really try to find people that I think would be a great connection to the film, and this seemed to be a perfect fit, especially with all the continued work you do with educating and bringing Hungarian students over. So it was wonderful to have you part of the festival this year, even though we had to do it virtually. Thank you to our cultural arts sponsors, M&T Bank, Erie County, Town of Amherst, the Wolk Foundation, and the Buffalo Jewish Federation. And I just want to remind everybody that our festival is running through August 21st. So there are still plenty of great films out there to watch. Tomorrow, we're actually having a live challah bake at noon in conjunction with Challah Rising in the Desert. And then next Tuesday, we'll have our final Tuesday talk back on the film, The Spy Behind Home Plate. So hopefully everyone will join us again. And in closing, I just want to throw it out there that the JCC in Buffalo also has been running some really great virtual programs in addition to this film festival. So if anyone's interested in finding out more, the fitness department has been amazing in offering all different kinds of fitness classes throughout this whole time when we've been closed. There's adult discussion groups still going on, and the Jewish Repertory Theater is going to be presenting an entire virtual season of 5 staged readings. So I encourage you all to check out the website. We're trying to keep everybody engaged and busy. And again, thank you for participating. Continue to enjoy the films, and hopefully we'll see some of you at the Challah Bake tomorrow. Thank you so much.